Welcome to the Jewish People Podcast. I'm your host, Yaakov Katz. Over the past weeks, what began as a campaign against Iran has unmistakably evolved into something far larger. It is increasingly a war that may hinge on one of the most strategic choke points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. The question now is no longer just how this war is fought, but also, and maybe more importantly at this point, how it will end. What does victory actually look like? Is it a diplomatic outcome, maybe a deal with Russian mediation that removes the enriched uranium from Iran? Or is it something more tangible, an American or some sort of international coalition that now controls the strait itself, reshaping the balance of power in the Gulf? At the same time, the war is reverberating far beyond the battlefield. In the United States, political support, both for the war and Israel, is being tested in real time, just like the resignation of Joe Kent earlier this week. And in the region, there are quiet but consequential questions about whether this moment could open the door to a new wave of normalization agreements between Israel and its neighbors in the Gulf. To unpack all of this, I'm joined by Dennis Ross, a counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and co-chair of the Board of Governors of JPPI. He previously served as the chief U.S. Middle East peace negotiator under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and later as the White House Middle East coordinator under President Barack Obama. Dennis is the author of several books, most recently Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. You'll want to hear what Dennis has to say about the war and the potential ways for how it could potentially end. Stay with us. Dennis, it's great to have you back on the show, and really thank you so much for taking out the time. I really wanted to check in with you and kind of see where you believe we are in the war at this moment, the progress that has been done, because we're seeing Israel really ramping up, even to some extent, the decapitation effort, the killing of Ali Larijani, the commander of the Basij, the intelligence minister, and really keeping up the pressure, not letting the foot off the gas. But at the same time, an understanding that really this might be shifting from a let's bring down the regime operation to let's keep the Strait of Hormuz open, or let's get it back open. So kind of from your perspective, where are we in the war at this point, and where are we going next?
Really good questions. I think one of the things that has complicated everybody's assessment is that the president and the administration have had fluidity, I'll put it, of objectives. Had the president been clear from the very beginning what the objective was and explained it in a consistent way, I think he would have more support within the country for what he's doing, and there'd be more insulation against the increase in the price of oil and gas. But that's not, it's not his style, and I think he all along wanted to be able to define the objective after the fact so he could claim maximum success, which is, I'm not saying that's an illegitimate way to approach things. From a political standpoint, it might be good, but it's inconsistent, as you know, with my approach to statecraft, where the clearer your objectives are, the easier it is to marry means to that, but in my mind also the easier it is to prepare your public and to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. So from a practical standpoint, an objective standpoint, in the war itself, if you measured what you wanted to be able to achieve in terms of dramatically setting back the Iranians as it relates to their nuclear program, there's not been an enormous amount done beyond what was done last June, but there's been more that's been done. What's been done on the ballistic missiles in terms of weapons depots, underground bunkers, what I'll call the production chain, because the ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and even drones have a whole infrastructure that relates to producing components. And what both we and Israel have done is go after that in a way that would make it very difficult for them to rebuild any of those rapidly, or to even rebuild any of them soon. And especially one of the things that tends to be forgotten, you're going to have an Iranian regime, we can get into this, whatever it is, whatever it looks like, whoever it is, it doesn't have answers right now to deal with all the grievances of the public that existed before the war, because they're going to be even weaker. On top of that, the ability to pour great resources into trying rebuilding means you're pouring no resources into addressing the needs of the public, which means sooner or later that anger, frustration is going to boil over again.
And the economic situation presumably will get only deteriorate as a result of all the attacks, etc.
Completely that's the case, meaning they'll be even less capable of dealing with their economic situation. And that means if you're diverting whatever you have into rebuilding these, it's going to make you even more vulnerable internally. So, objectively speaking, the administration in Israel have achieved a lot as it relates to what I call the dimension of reducing the regime's ability to threaten its neighbors in the region in Israel. The other dimension of regime weakening is going after the political leadership, the military leadership, and the control mechanisms, the Revolutionary Guard, the besieged, and the like. Here again, I think shaking the system and its ability to operate has clearly been done. Is it enough to bring the regime down? The answer is no. We're not seeing the kinds of defections you would need to see. We're not seeing units simply not show up. So the regime maintenance at this point may still be there, even if the regime itself understands harder to make decisions, much less secure in terms of who can make them and how long they're going to survive. That's still there. But they discovered their main point of leverage, which is access to the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. And we're in a paradoxical situation where we are allowing the Iranians to export their oil at a time when they're preventing almost everybody else from doing it. And for me, it makes no sense. I understand the logic, we have to have enough oil on the world market so the price doesn't go through the roof, and that allows us maybe to sustain this longer. But what you're doing is you're demonstrating to Iran they have a critical point of leverage. And their strategy at this point is to outlast Trump.
And you tweeted the other day that if Iran is preventing anyone else from exporting oil, then we being America, should be saying that if no one can, then Iran won't be allowed to either. So basically, that's ramping things up, right? Because as I've been watching kind of also the Gulf states who have been, obviously defending their own territory, but not necessarily participating in an active way in the war. It's kind of like they don't want to give the Iranians an excuse to attack their oil installations or gas depots, etc. Doing what you were suggesting, would that not lead to an escalation of that kind?
Well, it has the potential. What has a greater potential is if if we decide to destroy Kar Island, which means this is 90% of their
not
whole...
Not just the military installations, but the
take
gas,
out
oil stuff,
Then they have every incentive to do the same to the Gulf states. If we're denying the ability to export because you're denying others the ability to export, do they really have an incentive to go after the oil infrastructure at that point? Because then they know they're going to lose theirs. So it allows you to counter the leverage they currently have.
So what's the logic that the U.S. is not blocking the ships going to China or India then?
Because they don't want $150 barrel oil. That's the logic. You had the Secretary of the Treasury yesterday saying this explicitly. He didn't say the $150 barrel oil, but he said we're allowing them to export on the grounds that it's reducing the pressure on the world's needs for oil. But you're doing it at the price of giving them leverage over you and everybody in the region.
Because they decide which ship goes through and which ship doesn't go through. Exactly.
So they're allowing the Chinese ships to go through, they're allowing India to go through, and they're allowing Pakistan to go through, and nobody else. But it makes them the arbiter.
Yeah.
That a regime, on the one hand, we've dramatically weakened the regime, its ability to threaten others, and even its own capacity to operate and communicate. And at the same time, we've allowed them to strengthen their own image, that they're the arbiters of whether or not you can have oil on the market. And that's just not sustainable. And just one other point, what it tells me is Donald Trump was probably poised to already declare success. I mean, a week ago, in talking to congressional Republicans, he said, we've already pretty much completed it. And he was positioning himself to be able to say, look, we've set them back dramatically. They're not going to be a threat for a long time to come. That was the aim, and I'm prepared to stop. Now, his problem is, A, they want to be able to say, we didn't need to end the war, he had to end the war. But B, if they're still controlling access to the Persian Gulf, there's no way he can claim success. And so the war can't end so long as they're in a position where they can do that. So either you have to deny them that position, and we can talk about the different options for doing that, or you end up with some kind of mediation. And I've felt all along the most likely mediator is probably Putin, because the Iranians really don't have friends now because of the strategies they've employed. On the one hand, they still need the Russians. And therefore Putin can get them to give him something, and Putin wants to show he's relevant. He wants to be able to go to Trump and say, look, I helped you out of this, and I'll produce something for you, and therefore you can end the war. And then, the implication is, of course, you'll continue to be at least implicitly supportive of me as it relates to Ukraine. So that's why I've anticipated this.
Yeah, but what do you make, though, of those reports of that the Russians have been assisting the Iranians with the satellite imagery and targeting of America? That wouldn't undermine Putin's ability to be a mediator?
I don't think so, because look at how the administration has talked about that when it's been raised. They said, "Oh, it's not making any difference."
So they're
not saying
downplaying it, right?
Right. So they're dismissing it as having an effect, as opposed to saying this is the act of a hostile power, and there'll be consequences as a result. Look, we've also lifted the sanctions on their oil as a way, because again, we want their oil on the market so the price doesn't go through the roof. So that's where we are, I think.
Let me. There's a couple of questions I want to ask, but first one that's technical, because it's very interesting to me, and I want to get back to the Strait of Hormuz, but in a moment. The decapitation and the killing that's been taking place of leaders. What's interesting to me is it's all done, at least in the communication of it, all done by Israel.
Yeah.
It's always Israeli planes. Khamenei was Israel. There was some CIA intelligence that the Americans took credit for, but it was done by Israel. Larijani was Israel, the Basij commander, all these other people, everybody, the intelligence minister, Israel. Is it that America doesn't want to be directly involved in killing a military official or a politician, or do you see that just as the division of labor between what each military is focused on?
I think our military doesn't have a tradition of doing that. And CENTCOM developed the military plans, and I think it is a division of labor. I'm not sure that for President Trump it's something that he wouldn't consider doing, but the military comes to him with a set of military plans, says this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. And if he raises the issues, they say, that we don't have a tradition of doing that. And because our military also operates within certain legal constraints. There are real issues legally here about assassination of other leaders. So I think he's chosen not to challenge that because he can say, okay, the Israelis will do that. That will serve our interests, and we won't be doing it. In the meantime, we'll be hitting other targets.
Yeah, okay, because I've been just a very technical thing, but something that I found to be interesting that's always carried out by Israel. So moving back, though, and you spoke about the statecraft that you would like to see, which is in the communication. I think one of the problems that I've been feeling since the beginning of this war, and maybe why there's also a conversation, I'd like to get to this later on, is about, was this an imminent threat? Was it not an imminent threat? Was because of the way that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump communicated what happened after the 12-day war in June, right? Netanyahu spoke about a victory for generations. Trump spoke about the obliteration of Iran's nuclear program. And then 7.5 or 8 months later, we're back in there in a war that's much bigger in scope and size and time. So people legitimately can question, 1 second, you said victory for generations, what changed, right? And I wonder if they didn't make a big mistake back then in the way that they spoke about things, as opposed to just admitting we did some damage, we didn't cause enough, we might have to do this again. Like, that would have changed the whole conversation about this war to some extent.
I think you're right. I mean, look, when I When I wrote about Statecraft and Statecraft 2.0, I talked a lot about the framing of issues, not just about objectives, but the framing of issues, because the framing of issues is important for your domestic audience, but it's also important internationally. You want others to embrace your objectives. And so you frame issues in a way that also are for the moment, but also for over time. I think it was a big mistake to talk about for generations and to say obliteration. It built, unfortunately, a set of expectations, which now when you're back 7 months later or 8 months later and you're doing it again, now part of the rationalization is so that you don't have to do it again in 7 or 8 months. But had it been framed from the beginning, we've done this now, we've set them back, and it was a message to them that if they reconstitute, we will do it again. Had it been presented that way, it could have been understood more easily, and the fact that they've chosen to go ahead and try to do everything that they were doing before would have created the justification in a way that you don't see, at least for many, today. And this notion of imminent, again, the argument about imminent is almost kind of a replay of overstating what you were saying in the first place. It was not imminent. There was no way you can say it was imminent. When I hear them say, oh, they were this close to a bomb, they were not this close to a bomb. We didn't necessarily obliterate everything back in June, but we set it back dramatically. You know, they haven't been able to enrich. There are no centrifuges that are operating. The highly enriched uranium that everybody talks about that is worrisome, it's buried. And by the way, there's a tendency to downplay how simple it will be to extract it. It's buried in big canisters. This would be a huge operation, huge production. It could not be hidden. You would be able to see it. You would have the ability to say, okay, if you try to extract it, we'll take you out as you do it. So there, again, it's not presenting the essence of this in a way that ironically would make it better for publics to be able to absorb and say, okay, I can understand it.
But I mean, on the issue of the, what is it, 440 or 450 kilos?
450 kilos.
Yeah, I was talking with the military planner the other day because, there's all this talk, special operations commando, and he was like, it doesn't work that way. You would have to go in there with heavy machinery. You'd have to create perimeter. You'd have to be there for several days. It's not like it's not, getting Maduro in the middle of the night and flying him out with Delta Force, which is hard to imagine either Israel or America doing with that kind of amount of power. But Trump needs a victory image, right? And if you get the 450 and you pull it out, you say, I got it, I'm done. If the regime falls, you got your story to tell.
Right.
What's the story in the absence of those two that we can say? Because degrade, delay, I'm skeptical about that, especially after the 12-day war when I saw the generation victory and it was a 7-month victory.
Right.
So what would you, if the president called you and said, okay, Dennis, what can that victory image that I need? And listen, Donald Trump, we all know he needs that, right? Because he's going to declare victory either way, but he needs something tangible. What would you be able to give him, right?
Well, what I would tell him is he basically has two possibilities. One possibility is that we take over the Straits of Hormuz. We determine who's going through. And we then pass a Security Council resolution and we internationalize the Straits so that the Iranians have lost any control over it. That's an unmistakable victory. Now, the problem is that's going to take more time. First, we have to get, if you look at what the war plan has been, the war plan has been designed to achieve a variety of different objectives, of which the Straits of Hormuz was not in the top 10. Right? You were attacking the regime's control elements. You were attacking the whole infrastructure, not just, as I said, it's not just the ballistic missiles. It's not just the weapons depots. It's not just the underground tunnels. It's the launchers. It's every small factory that fabricated even machine tools that you use for an engine of a missile or the guidance system of a missile. None of them are co-located. So this was a really expansive set of targets you had to hit. Many of them were hardened. And then you had to provide protection for your own forces, and you had to provide protection for your allies, your partners and allies. So the assets were applied to all of that. The assets weren't applied to, okay, we're going to take out, when Trump says we've taken out their Navy. Yeah, but we haven't taken out the small boats. And they may have 1,000 of those, right? So, it's an important, and clearly one of the things the administration is learning is it's a really important objective because you can't end the war without having ended the Iranian control over this. But that would be one. An alternative would be, and this comes through a mediation. Let's say that Putin comes to him and says, I will produce for you an agreement and you will be allowed to monitor it so you see it, where we will be the ones to take out the 450 kilograms and it'll be stored in Russia. So, and that will effectively end any threat of their nuclear program. Okay, that's also his win. It actually looks a little bit, if someone were to tell him this, he probably wouldn't do it. It looks a little bit like Obama and the chemical weapons.
I was just thinking that as
Right.
that was Lavrov and at the time
And
also
Kerry, with Kerry, yes.
back in
But it
2013.
started with a conversation between Obama and Putin. And then they agreed, and then 90% was taken out. Well, in this case, so you'll get 100% taken out. But that would be, here are two symbols that he achieved what he needed to achieve. And it's hard to see it ending without that. I was going to say, maybe Mujtaba is taken out, although I'm not sure he's in any condition where he's leading anyway at this point. But that's not enough, because if they still control the Straits of Hormuz, you haven't achieved anything. You certainly will be presented as, yeah, you weaken them in one respect and you strengthen them in another. They never had this kind of a stranglehold before.
If the war, though, if America gets to some agreement with Iran that the high intensity stage comes to an end, so America and Israel stop the kinetic attacks, that would have to include that Iran, and even if America says we're now going to control the Strait of Hormuz, it would have to include Iran committing to not disrupting the flow or the sale of ships passing through the straits. Otherwise, right, that type of deal would not be worth much.
Right. But completely. But here again, I think it'll be a lot easier to create an international flotilla that's in there to guarantee the opening of the straits than if it's just us. And at that point, the cost of the Iranians saying, okay, we're going to take on everybody there, you can't rule it out. But here again, between now and the point you would get to that juncture, we will be attacking much more, the whole coastline. Where
we kind of started to see that, right? They dropped a bunch of bombs along the coast.
Today, we dropped a 5,000-pound bomb in the area right adjacent to the straits. And I think look, there is another option that ensures they really couldn't do it. I don't see Trump doing it, but it would be to put forces ashore.
Right, on the
Not
coast.
going into the heart, but just ashore, because the vulnerability is right along the shoreline. And then you go through there on the ground and you clean out whatever infrastructure they have that they could be threatening with.
What do you make, Dennis, of the Europeans here? Right, the British in particular and the French. The president has been calling them out publicly and saying, are you my ally or are you not my ally, basically? Yeah. And there's been a shift, and a shift, I would say, in a positive direction, but still not fully on board, in the sense that they would join a flotilla or they would, it would be a NATO operation or anything along those lines. Why are they, in my view, why are they so weak?
It's a good question. I think part of it is probably political, that there's no real public support for an intervention beyond kind of going in and defending certain assets. The French are there providing air defense now, but actively joining the system, a convoy, I think, it's a function of feeling they could lose some ships and they don't want to do that. B, it's a function of saying, look, this was a war of choice that the Americans chose and never talked to us about it. And now they want us to come in after the fact when they need our help. If you want our help, at the landing, you need to be there. We need to be there at the takeoff. Some of it is a bit of pique, I think. Some of it is Trump takes certain things for granted, and therefore we're going to make it clear that he wants us to be more independent. Well, by God, we're going to be more independent and not always responsive. It feeds his instinct, regrettably, to think, well, maybe we don't need to be a member of NATO. We will lose by that. I think at the end of the day, he won't pull out, but by the same token, it reinforces his own sense of going it alone. The irony is, one thing that would have made it more likely, again, it would have been a good example of statecraft. You build up this huge, as he called it, an armada before we go. Why weren't we talking to the Europeans at that point and saying, look, there is a real possibility that we could act, and here are the reasons we would act. Here's everything they've been doing since June. And it shows they didn't learn a lesson at all. And the lesson we should learn is you can't buy calm with them, because sooner or later they will do the thing that impose a much higher price on all of us. So let's do some contingency planning about if at some point they're going to act to try to shut down the shipping. Let's work out now our plans for what we will do in the event that happens. But we didn't do that. It would have been a much better application of statecraft if that's what we had done.
In the, with Europe not there, there is definitely an amazing joint operation between Israel and the United States here, and Israel is playing the role of, I guess, the European countries for that matter to some extent. And I'm curious because it comes at a time when there's been a lot of discussion here in Israel about the continuation of foreign military aid and what would happen when the current MOU expires in 2028, and would this president give it to Israel, et cetera. I mean, do you think that this changes now that whole conversation? Because we're hearing Pete Hegseth, we're hearing President Trump talk about Israel as the perfect example of what an ally should look like, right?
Yeah.
And the ability, we help them. They have our military platforms, but they know how to use them, and they're incredible. Maybe this makes a better case for Israel to come to the Americans and say, listen, keep helping us so we can keep helping you.
I think it does, but unfortunately we also have this taking place in a climate where both the right and the left look at Israel as being the instigator of the war. You have Joe Kent resigning yesterday as the head of the counterterror operation and writing this sort of noxious resignation letter where he blames it all on Israel, and even blames the Iraq War on Israel, which
his wife's death in 2019 in Syria on Israel.
Right. So he blames that all. He blames it all on Israel. Trump, to his credit, is saying no, but this is now part of the ethos, and it comes against a backdrop where this Israeli government already had a major problem with the Democrats, which Prime Minister Netanyahu's problem with the Democrats goes back to 2015 and going to the Congress to oppose the JCPOA. We didn't have the JCPOA yet. This was in March. That came in the summer, but it was looming. So he has a problem there. Then you have ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who make it clear we don't share any values because no one identifies with what they're doing. So you have a climate where anti-Semitism grows, in no small part because the way Israel's being portrayed. You look at someone like Josh Shapiro, who, if he's going to be a candidate for president, his Jewishness is a huge issue in a way that frankly would have been unthinkable before, because being Jewish is now equated with being Israeli for a significant part of the Democratic Party, or at least the left wing of the Democratic Party, but also for the right wing of the Republican Party and for the MAGA base. And what's the first podcast that Joe Kent is doing? You can guess who he's doing it with. He's doing it with Tucker Carlson. So that constituency is a real constituency. And so the balance of forces on the Hill right now are probably also changing. Look, the Republicans are still generally supporting Israel, and centrist Democrats on the Hill are still generally supporting Israel. But what's now legitimate is the idea that, if there's an arms sale to Israel, that it's now going to be questioned. And there will be those who would want to resist it. And that would have, in the past, this would have been unthinkable. So on the one hand, with Trump and Hegseth, there's no question their view is that this is the example of what an ally should do, and therefore we have a need to be responsive to them. I would say Israel needs to try to cash in on that when this is over, sooner rather than later, because the more time that goes by, the harder that's going to be as a sell.
And definitely if you get to the midterms and they don't go well for the president and for his party, it'll be even harder. I'm looking behind you over your right shoulder. There's a poster, Bakesh Shalom V'Radfehu, right? Seek peace and run after or chase after it. And Anwar Gargash, the diplomatic advisor to Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, the leader, the president of the Emirates, of the UAE, gave this briefing to the Council of Foreign Relations the other day and spoke about how this war paves the way, essentially, for better and warmer, closer ties, normalization between Gulf states and the state of Israel, how this is a real opportunity. I'm wondering also, so I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Like, are we going to see maybe the Saudi normalization come back in a way that it kind of had died out or fizzled out in the aftermath of October 7th? And also, is there maybe, and I know anyone who's listening to this now is going to say, okay, Yaakov is becoming a crazy lefty, but which is possible. But if Iran is changed or gone or the regime is done, does that not create an opportunity for us with the Palestinians in a way that we didn't have in the past?
I think yes. I mean, and if you don't mind, I want to give a historical backdrop to this, and then I'll pursue where we are, I think. In 2009, after Bibi had been elected, and he came for his first visit to see President Obama, George Mitchell and I were the ones who were in to brief him in advance, and Mitchell was there to do the peace process. I was there to talk to do Iran. And I said there's a relationship between these two. I said, if you are prepared to commit to the prime minister that we will do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon, and be very clear that this is a commitment. But you can also say that for you to be able to do that and to create an atmosphere in the region that creates more support for us as we do that, and that so we have other partners as we do it, he also has to be forthcoming on the Palestinian issue. I said for Bibi at that time, I said Iran is his Winston Churchill issue. He is seized with this in terms of the potentially existential threat that it represents. The strategic imperative that he sees for dealing with Iran overrides every other issue. And if you're going to make this kind of a commitment on Iran, he will be prepared to do more on the Palestinian issue. And he wasn't prepared to go as far as I was obviously suggesting.
He being President Obama.
President Obama. I mean, he was prepared, as he said to me, look, I'm prepared to make the effort. I'm prepared, in fact, if diplomacy doesn't work, to do what it takes. I'm just not prepared to make that commitment to him at this point because I don't want to tie my own hands. And I said, okay, I understand, but you asked me, because he asked Mitchell, and then he turned to me and said, okay, what do you think he can do on the Palestinian issue? And I said, here's the basis on which you can get him to go well beyond what would be the case otherwise. And in the end, he just didn't feel he could go that far. It's fine. Presidents make decisions. That's the way it goes. But I raise it now because if Iran is truly weakened and therefore and the whole proxy network has been dramatically set back, the leverage they have goes down dramatically. The fears that others will have goes down dramatically. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't change the climate of opinion that exists, for example, among the Saudi public. That MBS is not indifferent to, because the death and destruction in Gaza is still something that has affected the psychology and public attitudes. For Arwan Gargash to say that, it reflects the Emirates, they made, people don't really understand. The Emirates made a strategic choice. And they can be troubled by some things that this particular Israeli government does. It is interesting, by the way, he hasn't been invited to go there. Plenty of other Israelis haven't been invited.
Herzog, Bennett, Lapid, exactly.
Right. So it means that they think there were some promises made to them about what Ben-Gvir and Smotrich would not be allowed to do, and they don't think those promises have been fulfilled. Having said that, their commitment to Israel, it's a kind of unshakable. The commitment to the relationship is an unshakable one. I mean, when I was last there, one of their senior officials I was meeting asked me where I was going. I said, I'm going to Israel from here. He sort of laughed and said, well, of course you're going to Israel from here. We're the only ones who never cut off the flights. And the point is, for them, it's a strategic choice, and they're going to continue to make the case for it. For the Saudis, if you ask me, do they think at some point there'll be normalization with Israel? The answer is absolutely yes. But if you ask them, is it going to be soon, even when this is over? I think the answer would be no, unless they can point to something on the Palestinian issue. And it's true that the climate will change. The problem so far is the Palestinians haven't changed. And the climate within Israel. One thing I can tell you for sure, senior Saudis said to me when I was asking, okay, I know the climate has changed, and one thing I was told, look, the atmosphere has to be different. We can't move that quickly. The atmosphere has to be different. But then the other thing I was told in response to a question I asked, I said, okay, look, you say you need something from the Israelis on the Palestinians. Point 19 of the 20 points, of the Trump 20 points, says if the Palestinian Authority faithfully carries out reform, that can create a pathway to self-determination and state for the Palestinians, which is the aspiration of the Palestinian people. So presumably that point is there because of you, that this is what it took for you to sign off on this. And the answer was, yeah. So I said, so why isn't that good enough? And they said, because we know that's Trump's commitment. We need to know it's the Israeli government's commitment. So that tells you that this is not an impossible pathway, but look, I don't need to tell you the climate in Israel. The image of a Palestinian state being led by Hamas is still what I think is the October 7th overhang. You can't
definitely not going to happen with this government, that's for sure.
That's right. But I think, again, let's see over time. No one right now in Israel, or let's say, there are some exceptions, but the mainstream in Israel right now is not going to be supportive of the idea, let's go embrace the idea of Palestinian statehood. That's just not the reality. But for those who think that can never change, if Iran is no longer a threat, and if in fact, and this is something I've pushed on the Saudis and others, if they produce real reform on the Palestinian side, and one of the things I've said to them is, you always expect us to be able to move the Israelis. But you have responsibility too. And it's in your interest that there be reform among the Palestinians, because there's never going to be a state without it. There's not going to be a political reunification. There's not going to be the ability to assume responsibility. There can't be statehood without real reform that changes fundamentally the fundamental corrupt character of the Palestinian Authority. So that's a precondition. And that's, by the way, that's why point 19 says, if they faithfully carry out reform.
Dennis, you remind me as you're talking about this, and I think the dramatic changes that come from Iran. I remember after the JCPOA, I was in a briefing with Gadi Eisenkot, who was then the chief of staff, and he was talking about how now with the it's not gone, but the threat declined and diminished. I can take money that I had in the IDF and I had to invest in what they called the third circle, right? So the threat's far away, and I can start putting them in the ground forces and other, right? I think we don't yet imagine the amazing consequences and ripple effect that the change of regime, if we can get there, or something even close to that, has, and even helps us definitely, as you said, with the Palestinians. So let me thank you very much, Dennis, as always, for being with us and sharing your thoughts and enlightening everyone on what might come still in this war. Thank you.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and the website of Times of Israel. I'm wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom, a quiet weekend, safe, hopefully, no matter where you are. We'll be back next week with more updates on the war against Iran and what is still to come.